up behind this podium. Okay. All right. So, I'm a very different kind of Buddhist nun in the sense that I've spent 10 years living in an Indian slum, living socially engaged Buddhism with one of the poorest Buddhist communities in the world, the ex-untouchable Dalit community who converted to Buddhism in 1959 to escape the Indian caste system that had enslaved them. And for about 5,000 years they could not own land, they could not access water from the well, the women were, physically violated and the men were enslaved, and often they worked for no money at all. Very similar to the way African Americans were treated in America, but it went on much longer. And the difference between the way Hindus treated Dalits and the way Christians treated slaves was that on Sunday every slave was equal in the eyes of God. But on Sunday in the Hindu temple, the Dalits couldn't even go inside. They weren't considered worthy of meeting God in the temple, and they were considered to come from the feet of God. And they were punished by the idea of destiny, of karma as destiny. It must be your bad karma to be enslaved. Therefore, we will be apathetic to your plight. We will do nothing about it. And we will benefit from your oppression, your spiritual inferiority. So you can understand that these people wished to escape that oppression. And in 1956, Dr. Ambedkar, who was like the Martin Luther King Jr. of his people, led 100,000 Dalits to convert to Buddhism in Dikshubhumi in Nagpur in central India. And that is the city, an industrial city where it's 47 degrees in summer. That is the city where I've lived for the last 10 years. We have a girls' home. We respond to the needs of the people according to their wishes. I didn't take my own white savior agenda there. I just sat with them. It wasn't my intention to start a charity, but I went there and they said, we need help. And I realized how much white privilege I have and how much easier it is for me to access money. And I gave that money, which isn't a lot in Australia, but could be a great deal, can save a life there. Do you want to know how much it costs to save a life in India? $5. How much does it cost to feed 500 people? Maybe $2 a head. $1,000 feed 500 people. So that's the background that I'm coming from when I speak to you today. Our charity is called Bodhicitta Foundation. So, social engagement is not just to be cool or green or woke. Our future's survival depends on it. We live in times of unprecedented challenge. Previous generations faced the possibility of apocalypse from world wars or nuclear bombs. But those threats might happen, they weren't actually things that did happen. The threat of a third world war, the threat of nuclear holocaust. But we know that crisis of climate change is real. 98% of scientists believe it. And they say within 20 to 30 years it could bring about complete social collapse. So that's hard to hear. And I encourage you to come back to your breath if you're feeling anxious. But we do need to talk about these issues. The UN has said that climate change is the biggest threat to human rights and well-being. So yes, things look bleak. But at times like this, we need to weaponize optimism, we need hope, something called hope punk. So I'm sure some of you have watched Game of Thrones, right? See, in India we have Game of Thrones without all the sexy bits. So I could enjoy it as a monastic and not feel guilty. And there's this great character called Jon Snow, and he's just like this bodhisattva warrior who always stands up for what is right and does what is good, even though it doesn't always benefit him personally. So he's a great example of hope punk. That is a really cool, spiritual, sacred warrior who engages in the fight to bring about the greatest well-being for others when things look very bleak. And it's easy to go into shock in the face of climate change. But there are still many things we can do. And I'm not going to go into these things now. Many of them are mentioned in the movie 2040, and you yourself can do the research. You have Google, and you have even more ethical search engines than Google. But we need hope punk, an attitude that weaponizes realistic optimism and makes us take action in the face of injustice and disaster. To not just, hunker down in a bunker with some AK-47s and lots of tins of sardines and baked beans. But to think how we can act with compassion, how we can unite as a community, even as we are facing these terrible things. And famine is on the horizon. So last year Bhante Sujato gave a talk about this and everybody booed him. Like not booed him really, but in the survey they kind of booed him. But I actually think we need to have these conversations. It's a very important topic. This is not really the topic of my talk, but I'm just talking about what we're heading into. We are now going through what Joanna Macy called the Great Turning, a transition from a profit-driven culture of dominance, where we view the earth as something to be exploited and we view people as agents of profit-making, to a culture that is life-sustaining and a culture of nurturance. That is the culture we need to create if we are going to survive. In these times, we will need a change of values to move from a culture that values assertiveness, aggression, and domination to a culture that values, instead of how much one takes, but rather what one gives. We will need to re-establish a sacred relationship with the earth and develop new ways of measuring success. We will need self-care, community, resilience, spirituality based on the sacred interconnectedness of life, soup kitchens, legislation to protect the planet and people and human rights, forest protests, and to live in joy even as the climate crisis dawns, learning to be content with less. If everyone wanted to live like an American, we would need 21 planets to support it. Thich Nhat Hanh said, "We meditate in order to see the truth. Once we see the truth, we must act." This is the crucial sentence missing from most Buddhist centers' agenda. They say, come here, find peace, and then nothing happens. That's it. And, especially amongst white Buddhists, who are usually well-educated, upper middle class in the eastern suburbs, there is this idea that Buddhism is an individual practice that you do, a commodity that you purchase for stress relief. Maybe you're having a midlife crisis, so you go to a mindfulness course, you get some insights, you write a book, you make $1 million, something like that. Sound familiar? But actually Buddhists are not just navel gazers, okay? That is not, we have something called right effort, which is part of the Noble Eightfold Path. And Buddhist monasteries were not just places of useless navel gazers. Buddhist monasteries were welfare centers. Buddhist monasteries ensured social cohesion and the well-being of those who fall into marginalization. How does that work? Young children, orphans, would go into the monastery and get an education. Elderly people who had not a lot to do would come there, do their practices, meditate, have a bit of a gossip, chop up some vegetables in the kitchen, and feel happy, and feel that they had a community center, they had usefulness, and pass on their wisdom to the younger generation. Anyone who lost their job would go and help in the kitchen, so they had a safety net as well. They had food to eat, as long as they volunteered for the monastery. So the monastery served a social purpose as well as the purpose of gaining awakening. And this is something that white Buddhists have not fully understood. We view Buddhism, because so many centers are forced to run on a business model to survive. We have this idea that Buddhism is an individual practice where we seek individualistic bliss from the madding crowd, far from the madding crowd, in golden, sylvan solitude. But if we are to survive climate crisis and if we are to become a strong community, we absolutely do need to unite and to work together for communal events. Asian people have always understood this, and you see that more Asian people volunteer in Buddhist events than white people, sadly. But you know, this is also matched with meditation, which is also the heart of Buddhism, and self-care. And every activist, every socially engaged Buddhist probably neglects that. And also, you know, we have this idea of Buddhism as a one-dimensional, flat thing, and we kind of sometimes tend to oversimplify it. It's like, I don't know if any of you are old enough to remember, you know, those cut-out flat dolls, and they would stick the clothes on them, and you could change the clothes. Or like for Americans, it would be flat Stanley. And you have these flat clothes that you can change on this cardboard cutout doll. You know? So I think some of us think that that's what Buddhism is. We've taken the medicine of Buddhism, and Buddhists are happy, Buddhists are peaceful, anger is bad, every kind of suffering comes from defilements, and that's true. But does that mean that we just take our emotions and go, hide it away, stick it down? By all means, don't say what you really think. You know, don't be authentic, because there's no self. Yeah? Your suffering doesn't matter, because there's no self. If you have needs, that's bad. You're egotistical, you know. And I think we've misunderstood a little bit. We've taken it a little bit too far. We've taken a very one-dimensional, flat understanding of Buddhism. We don't know how to work. It's not just a case that you just suddenly uproot your emotions and you're suddenly not a real person anymore, a normal person. That you suddenly change. You know, you suddenly don't have any anger. I'm fine. It's not like that. The mess, you know, and we feel bad. Like, I'm a bad Buddhist if I'm angry. I'm a bad Buddhist if I swear. I'm a bad Buddhist if I ate some meat at Grandma's barbecue. I'm sure the vegans are coming for me now. Yeah, I mean, none of those things are good on a regular basis. But another great Buddhist, Leonard Cohen, said, I can't remember the exact order, ring out the bells that still can ring, forget your perfect offering, there is a crack in everything, that is how the light gets in. So what that means is the mess, the messiness, the ugliness of humanity, the compost that grows the roses, all the things that have happened to you, the trauma, the paranoia, the neuroses, are the basic ground of goodness from which you start turning the garden bed that will grow something good in you. No mud, no lotus. So these things are not things we just don't throw away ourselves and our emotions. We have to work with them. We have to work through our suffering and our karma. And that is the path. You know, and that is how we grow. The question is, do we do it with mindfulness and awareness and wisdom, where we watch our emotions and we neither oppress nor act out on them? Or do we indulge every thought and emotion that comes into our head and behave like a unbalanced addict? Do you see what I mean? There's one extreme of suppression and the other extreme of acting out. And the Buddhist path is the middle path of watching your emotions, allowing them to transform, of feeling what you're feeling, gaining insight. But it's not just suddenly that you suddenly become a different person, you know? Most of us like the idea of socially engaged Buddhism until it requires to check our privilege and challenges us to make a radical self-inventory. That is when the spiritual bypassing starts. Spiritual bypassing is using spiritual ideas and practices to sidestep or avoid facing unresolved emotional issues, injustices, conflicts, emotional wounds, and unfinished developmental tasks. We're trying to transcend the pain and the messiness of the human condition before we have really made peace with it. In Tibetan Buddhism, I've heard two translations of the word bodhicitta. One is the genuine heart of sadness. And what does that mean? That means that you know your own suffering, and therefore you know your own brokenness, and therefore you can empathize with others who are stuck in samsara. Or the genuine heart of tenderness, which is altruistic, impartial attitude that understands others are as worthy of you as receiving love and equal to you. And that everybody as being your lover, best friend, beloved pet dog, mother, whatever. Westerners are more attached to their dogs than their partners sometimes. Sorry, but it's true, we have a 50% divorce rate. So everybody's being someone you love, you know? That's the idea. Yeah. But getting back to spiritual bypassing, it manifests as exaggerated detachment, emotional numbing and repression, hyper-positivity, anger phobia, blind, overtly tolerant compassion, weak boundaries. So social justice is the idea of human flourishing, the idea of fair and just relations, an equitable distribution of resources, peaceful and prosperous relationships between individuals and society, as well as basic human rights like safety, education, housing, healthcare, and protecting the vulnerable. The principles of social justice are access. 1, overcoming unfairness caused by unequal access to resources, goods and services, economic resources and power. And equality doesn't look the same for everyone. Because, you know, a person in a wheelchair doesn't need the same kind of help as a person who can't speak English, right? So there is diversity in that equality, there's equity in that equality, which is the next one, equity. And then rights, equal, effective, legal, industrial, and political rights. Participation, expanded opportunities for people to participate in the decisions that govern their lives. So, the ancient Greeks spoke of 3 aspects of the human field of studies: truth, beauty, and love. These were reflected in science, the arts, and religion and philosophy. Socrates spoke of the need for radical self-examination, as did the Buddha. The unexamined life is not worth living, but the examined life can be painful. The Buddha acknowledged that suffering comes from ignorance, through not seeing the sacred connectedness of all things, through being trapped in the cocoon of selfhood. He said that life and the world has much suffering, but we should also remember that there is an end to suffering. Release, peace, compassion, joy, like fire unbound, when ignorance is cast aside and self-care is immediate. Insisting spiritual solutions can end material problems without any action is irresponsible. A person with HIV cannot out-meditate HIV. It's also illogical and apathetic, a misunderstanding of Buddhist teachings. Turn your mind to that which matters, to life, death, joy, and sorrow, not superficiality. We are time poor more than ever, but our time is taken up with devices that steal our time and don't enrich us. In the face of everything, we have to be courageous. We are all intimately interconnected. An individual is the result of spiritual, social, economic, and cultural conditions. If you change their conditions, they can thrive. It is great to purify our mind, but people should not also suffer needlessly because of apathy. Sometimes we are apathetic to the suffering of others, not because we are really equanimous, but because their enslavement suits our comfort. When something is very cheap, it means somebody is paying a personal price for that. For your on-sale clothes, a Bangladeshi woman is paying the price for that. You know? For the Dharma Center that offers things freely, where nobody donates, the monastic is being pushed into poverty for that. For the Buddhist school that's running beyond its budget margins, somebody is paying the price for that. Karma is not destiny, and if we do nothing when people cry out for justice, we are not implementing the perfections of a bodhisattva, a spiritual warrior, committed to work for the liberation of others from suffering. We are not implementing morality, right action, and compassion. We are accumulating the karma of negligence. Karma means action, not destiny. It can change. It should not be a way to be judgmental of others, because we all have bad karma. The sword of Damocles is hanging over all our heads. Therefore, have compassion and don't judge. In the end, what kind of person are you? Is the world a better place for you having been in it? We talk about compassion a lot in Buddhism, but justice is how compassion looks in public. We shouldn't ignore injustice. You can't be compassionate and tell people who suffer that their suffering does not matter because of some philosophical idea of emptiness you have in your head, that they or you have not realized. Do you want the truth that brings justice, or do you want to feel comfortable and not be challenged, but rather be entertained by sanitized discourse? The spiritual path is about waking up, not just comfort. Professor Cornel West said, "Don't become well-adjusted to injustice." Rabbi Joshua Heschel said, "Indifference to evil is more insidious than evil itself." You know, during the Holocaust, there were people who just went to the office 9 to 5, just typing up names and numbers, and it was as normal as an Excel spreadsheet for them, because the people on the names and numbers were othered. Something pernicious had happened in their mind, so that those human beings were not human beings anymore. Be careful. It happens all the time. When we as Buddhists tell people that their suffering doesn't matter, their poverty doesn't matter, that they're going to hell because they're gay, that they're inferior beings because they have women's private parts, how enlightened or compassionate is that? And yet those things go on every day. Our friend showed us how many Buddhist schools do we have? How many hospitals do we have? How many Buddhist social work centers do we have? Bad things happen when good people do nothing. In what ways does our apathy as Buddhists and our insistence that only the mind and not oppression, not real world sufferings like sexism, racism, and poverty allow evil to flourish? 3 people in America have as much money as half of America. 8 people in the world, all men, have as much money as the bottom half of the world. So 3.5 billion people. It may take a crisis to challenge the status quo, that a system based on profit before people, or the idea of infinite growth in a world of finite resources, may not be wise. But these are questions we need to ask, and changes we need to make if our children are to have a future. We absolutely need to be active citizens, because while corporations fund our politicians, they are not acting in our interest unless we stand up and say, please act in our interests. I spoke of beauty, truth, and love. And a lot of us, when we come to the spiritual path, we naturally want to hear uplifting, inspiring things that make us feel good. I understand that. But are the most beautiful works of art we have, the songs, the arias, the poems, are they all easy? Did they come about through an easy process? Or did they come from someone wrestling with their terror, their fears, their despair, their pain, and working it into something beautiful? Did the Buddha leave a kingdom and a beautiful wife and a lovely child? He was tormented in some way. He saw suffering, and he sought the truth. He wrestled with his demons. Act with honesty and integrity. The dominance of the status quo may be flawed. The government needs to tell the truth about climate change. You may say you agree in principle with justice and love making a better world, but who is speaking at your pulpit? Do you support those creating social change? Do you support female teachers, nuns, social workers? Are you present to real-world sufferings and reality? Is humanity and your family? Martin Luther King said, justice at its best is love correcting everything that stands against love. Intersectionality is another really important idea in social justice. It's understanding how people can be marginalized and affected by things like gender, race, class, language, culture, ethnicity, age, ability, disability, location, language, religion, history, race, education, sexual preference, occupation, and income. So, you know, a white feminist in Vaucluse may think she has a lot in common with an Aboriginal woman in Mount Druitt. We're both feminists, sister. Fight the patriarchy. But fighting the patriarchy from Vaucluse is very different to fighting the patriarchy from Mount Druitt. You know, and her Aboriginality and her poverty and maybe the substance abuse issues of people around her will be feeding, and intergenerational trauma and white settler culture dominance will be all factors that make her path much harder than the white feminist in Vaucluse. And that doesn't mean that the white feminist in Vaucluse is a bad person or doesn't suffer or that her suffering doesn't matter. It just means that she doesn't face obstacles for being black or for being Aboriginal or for being poor. She maybe has another set of problems. You see what I mean? So the person in Vaucluse probably has more leverage, more privilege that she can leverage to benefit others. But how do you benefit others? You don't go in there and say, I know better because I'm wealthy and well-educated. You make yourself very humble. And you say, I've come here because our well-being is interconnected. So tell me what you need. Let me be an ally. I'll just listen and let us work together in all humility, because I'm aware of the history of what my people have done to you, and I don't want to create that small, violent, racist dynamic in my relationship with you now. So I'm going to let you talk first, and more. Social and political identities overlap, so use your privilege to give others a voice. Act because the well-being and liberation of yourself, I've said that, yeah. So there are several arguments Buddhists use to dismiss worldly suffering and the lived oppression of minorities that are misunderstandings of the teachings or oversimplification of the teachings. Like one example is, your experience of gender inequality or racism does not matter because everything is impermanent and self is an illusion. You know, or you'll bring up some controversial subject and they'll say, yeah, don't be political. Buddhists are neutral. But if you are neutral in situations of oppression, you have joined the side of the oppressor. Until we are enlightened, we live in the relative world. Emptiness is not nihilism, it is fullness. Because I had non-self elements like my mother, my father, my culture, my gender, my education, the farmers who give me food, the sun, the rain, the earth, I am empty of a separate self, but full of all of heaven and earth. Emptiness is fullness. Therefore, others are my second self. Therefore, caring for the earth is caring for myself, caring for my neighbor, making sure they don't become homeless and a threat to society, a cause of civil unrest, is caring for my second self. Making sure we have a welfare system that cares for the most vulnerable is also to my well-being, because my kids won't end up getting kidnapped. I won't live in fear of robbery or carjacking. You see how our well-being is tied together, and happiness is not just a personal matter, it is a communal matter. If one person in a family is suffering, it affects everybody. Therefore, we have to start working together. We can't save the world just by buying bamboo toothbrushes. We need to unite, educate, agitate, organize, non-violently. Samsara is another one. Samsara is flawed and we can't make a difference, and we should just focus on our minds. You can fix everything in your mind. You can't control the outside, but you can fix everything in your mind. How often have you heard this? It's all fine if you're that white feminist in Vaucluse, but if you're the woman in Mount Druitt being beaten by her husband with no job and about to go out on the street because you don't have money for rent, your problem is not in your mind. Your problem is in the structural violence of society that, 1, discriminates against you because you're black, 2, discriminates against you because you're Indigenous, 3, discriminates against you because you have intergenerational trauma that you can't afford to get treatment for, that you won't get a job with. Her problems are not mental, her problems are social, and they need to be fixed on a social level. That's what I realized in India, you know. First I'd go there. I was once a very orthodox, tradition-loving nun who would never raise a bad word against the patriarchy. Shocking to believe, I know. But, you know, I went there and I taught them these things, and they were like, yeah, but I'm afraid my husband's going to kill me tonight, and my baby's screaming because she has no food. You know, someone put a baby in my lap that was dying of diarrhea, and she said, pray for my baby, Mataji. And I just thought, this is ridiculous. This baby doesn't need prayers. Thoughts and prayers. Namaste. No, this baby needs antibiotics that cost $2. We need meditation, we need peace. We need that every day. I'm not saying we don't need that, and I'm not shaming you for wanting peace or needing to escape the world and caring for yourself now and then. I totally support that, because our lives are frantic. You know, and most of us are so overwhelmed by the growing cost of living that we're just treading water. So we don't feel like we have a lot to give back to society. But you know, we do need to question, because iceberg dead ahead. And they're just pretending the Titanic will never sink. People may, you know, yes, samsara is flawed, but we got union rights, we got children out of factories, we got women the vote, we ended slavery. We talk about racism, we haven't ended it yet, but we talk about it and we're trying to address it. So if we can do those things, action is absolutely necessary. And good things do happen when good people do things. Yeah, we need to do things, we need to be active, as well as taking care of our mind and watching what our motivation is. Another one is another spiritual cliche. What people experience is their karma, so we should not bother to help them. Somebody wrote this on the page of a woman who had been raped and burned alive in India. Karma means action, not destiny. So change a person's circumstances. What if that girl was in school and not in a marriage at the age of 13? What if that girl got a scholarship to Harvard? What if that girl became the next head of the UN? What if that girl became Mother Teresa? What if that girl had a chance to reach her potential? There are 100 million girls waiting to go to school. Our children don't want to go to school. But 100 years ago, half of us couldn't read and write. And we were working in factories. So karma is not fixed. None of our conditions is permanent and should not be used, karma should not be used as a value judgment. Should be used as a cause of compassion. They may have the karma for you to help them. And if you don't, it's negligence. So Buddhism is not just about here. It's about taking these good things and putting them in the world. Because the world is our second self. And we can see, reflected in the climate crisis, a great tragedy of our loss of connection to each other and to the planet, to the sacred. The Native American activists at Standing Rock are saying, water is life, the earth is sacred. We really should listen to them. Because they are not the savages, we are. They are not the ones raping the earth, we are. They are not the ones killing their children's future, we are. So I know when I talk to people this way, they come away and they're like, oh my God. It's, you know, it's like 2 minutes to midnight. We need to do something, but we also need to do it with a peaceful heart and a bit of joy, because the world may end before we finally get what we want. So live each day well. Remember to drink your tea well, to see the clouds in your tea, to smile, to let the ones you know, the ones you love know that you love them. You know, to weaponize your optimism in a skillful and loving way. But if you want to be socially engaged, the first and most important thing to do is listen, is to check your privilege and listen. Because I've had a lot of people tell me as a nun what they think I need. It's so irritating. I'm sorry. I love you all, but it drives me nuts. You know, like, I ordained with 15 people, and there's only me and one other nun left. Tibetan Buddhism has been in Australia for 40 years, and there's still not one Tibetan Buddhist centre that supports a Western monastic without charging them. You know, there was a nun in a centre in Sydney paying $250 a week, and then they said, oh, you can have a $50 discount if you clean the Lama's room. So the male Tibetan Lama was staying for free, and the Tibetan nun who was born in Australia was a slave, basically, a pleb. That has never happened in the history of Buddhism, you know. And also, how do we unconsciously perpetuate patriarchy? You know, like people say to me, oh, I didn't really know Buddhist nuns existed. And every Buddhist woman in theory thinks, yes, I'm a feminist, I appreciate gender equality. But they always go and support monks. You know, we have no support. We have a 90% disrobing rate. It keeps getting higher. Three more people in the age group of monastics who are doing social work, who are holding space for community, who are giving teachings by donation. In that age group, you know, early 30s, late 30s, because they'll have long health to teach longer, that upcoming generation of monastics that we need to stay ordained, they are the ones disrobing. And the fact that we have no schools, no hospitals, that we are the smallest minority in any gathering of social justice, and the fact that our monastics are destitute, especially the Tibetan Buddhist ones, it's a symbol of our failure to unite as a community, because we think Buddhism is an individual path. You know? And I know that the Buddhist community doesn't have heaps of money. I know that many people come to Buddhism because they're marginalized in some way. They're queer, maybe they have a mental health issue. A lot of women making 75 cents to the dollar. You know, single mothers. I understand that. I don't expect to live in a palace, but I do expect, after 18 years of really hard work, to not starve, to not be sleeping in my car like I was last year. You know? So it would really help if we could unite. We're so divided by my tradition, my teacher, my center, you know? And then we find out that it's also the age of disillusionment in some ways, because the baby boomers are receding. Such a wonderful, enthusiastic, affluent generation. Sorry, but comparatively affluent in property, because property was much cheaper. Most millennials can never aspire to own a home. They aspire to own a tiny home. We have the baby boomers receding, and we have a much more cynical generation coming up, you know, the millennials. Cynical for good reason. You know, have you looked at the price of rent and inflation? You know, people don't come, they think they can just go and watch a teaching online. You know, they don't have as much time. They're busy with their mortgages and their kids, and they're much more cynical about religion. And we find out, you know, that these teachers have been doing things that are a little bit dodgy, so that makes us lose faith as well. But you can't get the same kind of benefit from an online teaching that you can from a person who is living that in front of you, who you can watch in an embodied way. That community is very important in healing. And so many of us now are living alone. You know, even dating has been commodified. Maybe they'll do that. Do you think they'll have a Buddhist monk Tinder eventually? Like, I like that teacher, don't like that one. Her nose is too big. She talks about feminism too much. Anyway, so please think about how you can contribute to community. Maybe you don't have money, but you have time. Maybe you don't have time, but you have money. Maybe you have IT skills. Most Buddhist centres are now running at a loss. So we do absolutely need your help. And that's probably as much as I have time to say. I think just in closing I will say there was a wonderful psychologist called Viktor Frankl who survived the Holocaust. And he said, don't look for happiness, look for meaning. If you look for meaning, you will automatically find happiness. You know, and live with integrity. If you have compassion in your heart, you need never fear. May you be well and happy. Thank you.